Power Hour of 4 gatherings so that we might learn more deeply as a community and more meaningfully in service to one another. I'm Rhonda Bannard, founder and executive director of Earth Gives and Earth Gives Day, and I would like to honor the ancestral lands on which I stand. So I recognize the O'odham, Acamel, and Hohokam as the original inhabitants and traditional stewards of this place. We are thrilled for this presentation with the Climate Justice Alliance. Mark Chavez has been an early and important teacher for me on my own journey. We are now in our final week of Earth Gives, and that's 25 days of giving to boost environmental philanthropy beyond 2%. And we know that this ecosystem of environmental nonprofits is key to lifting up and speed up and scale the work of what they do so that we can address climate change and climate justice. You will find a number of climate justice organizations at earthgives.org right now: Global Green Grants, the Institute for Sustainable Communities, Heal Food Alliance, the Global Center for Climate Justice, and many others. And among them, the Alliance for Appalachia. This is my honor to introduce you to the steward of that alliance. Her name is Lyndsay Taurus. She coordinates members that represent communities all impacted by destructive resource extraction and environmental injustices. The primary focus of the alliance is on mountaintop removing coal mining. Water, health, and livelihoods are all impacted. So it is my honor to throw it over to Lyndsay to tell us a little bit about herself and what she does and how she's connected to the Climate Justice Alliance. Lyndsay?
Hey, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much. My name is Lyndsay. I use she, her pronouns. I live in rural Virginia on traditional homelands of Tutelo and Saponi indigenous people. Where I live, our drinking water is poisoned by forever chemicals. The energy company controls much of the land and politics, and the Mountain Valley natural gas pipeline project is under construction, tearing through over 300 miles of steep mountainous terrain, public and private property, and hundreds of streams as well. I'm here today representing the Alliance for Appalachia. We're a coalition of 15 grassroots and frontline organizations in the mountains of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Virginia, and Alabama. And as Rhonda said, our members originally came together to stop mountaintop removal, which is an extreme form of coal mining that destroys mountains by literally using bombs to blast the tops off of the mountains, burying the streams below, causing horrific impacts to our health and our economies as well. And once I'm done speaking, I'm going to drop some links in the chat so that you all, if you're not familiar with mountaintop removal, that you can visualize and see what it looks like. And, so we, the Alliance for Appalachia, we're an environmental justice organization that puts leadership development at the heart of everything we do. Our members come together to share resources, to build skills, strategies, and solutions. And when I talk about mountaintop removal, this is the fight that we're on the front lines of. But as a coalition, we're connected to various ways that fossil fuel extraction impacts all of us, from the tax base of our local counties to the quality of our drinking water, to the ways we can or can't access the land around us, and the ways that we participate in the decisions that impact our lives. Like what opportunities are there for us to be involved in decision making, and where are the ways that fossil fuel industry kind of puts their foot down, or gets in the way of us being able to make those decisions for ourselves. So it's not just the mining itself, but the ways the fossil fuel industry is entrenched in capitalism and racial injustice as well. And one project in particular that I want to call attention to and ask you all to take action on is to help us stop the proposed Letcher County prison, which would be built on top of a toxic abandoned mountaintop removal site. And again, I'll drop this in the chat. And this is just a project that I want to draw attention to so you can see, again, the ways that different injustices are intersecting: environmental, social, racial injustice. But I was invited here tonight to introduce the Climate Justice Alliance. And while we organize regionally with the Alliance for Appalachia, we connect with the broader movement for climate and environmental justice through CJA. Through that alliance, we learn about the ways our local fights are part of global movements for change. We strengthen each other's capacity by understanding the ways that our fights are interconnected. We strengthen each other's communities by being together in this work. And I think maybe most importantly, too, is that Climate Justice Alliance and the Alliance for Appalachia, we're led by and for frontline communities, meaning people that are directly impacted by these industries. And since we're here as part of the Earth Gives Day fundraising event, I just wanted to add that when you give to a coalition or to an alliance like ours, the impact of your gift right away is multiplied right off the bat, because everything that we do is in community. Everything we do, as CJA says, is to build the bigger we, so to expand who we are and who's part of our communities and our movements for climate justice. So if we have $5,000, just for example, to support 10 people at a lobby day or a leadership development conference, that's 10 people who will carry what they gained and share it back with 15 more organizations just in our alliance. And like I said, everything that we do is in the name of collaboration. So that means through fundraising as well, and through the ways that we spend our funds. If you live in Appalachia or the South, please reach out to me. I would love to connect and help you connect with our member organizations. And if not, connect with us through the Alliance for Appalachia anyway. We want to know you and be in relationship with you. So thank you so much. And I'll pass it over to Monica and Mark.
Thank you so much, Lyndsay and Rhonda. Maybe to start off, Monica, can you just give us like your really quick 30 seconds of who you are, where you're coming from, just so people can orient?
Yes, so as Mark said, my name is Monica Atkins. I'm one of 3 co-executive directors of the Climate Justice Alliance, originally from Chicago, and spent a lot of my time and actually live in Mississippi, but just here visiting family today. Come from a background of organizing communities in Mississippi, and working with the various labor unions, from Nissan workers, from the United Auto Workers, organizing Nissan workers, to working with teachers, as well as state and government employees. And then finding my way to the environmental justice world through my work with Cooperation Jackson, before coming into the Climate Justice Alliance and serving in various roles and into my current role. So thank you all for having us today, and taking time out of this evening to hear from us. And I'll pass it to you, Mark.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Mark Chavez. I live in Bozeman, Montana, which is traditional, hunting grounds and homelands to more tribes than I can remember or name right now. But suffice it to say that this valley that I live in was so so much of a community space that it's the only place on federal treaty that was ever recognized as a communal hunting ground. Where, you know, the federal government recognized everywhere else as like, that was this tribe, this was that tribe, and this valley that I live in, they didn't even feel comfortable determining that when they were determining everything for everybody. And so that's where I'm coming from. I've been with Climate Justice Alliance for about, I think I'm coming up on my 4-year anniversary right now. And yeah, just a history of lots of grassroots and frontline activism, traveled a lot in my early 20s, ended up at a lot of protests and doing things like that, and eventually got integrated into the Climate Justice Alliance space. So really happy to be here with y'all talking about this work. And so just so you all know, today we're going to start by kind of defining some terms and just kind of getting us all on the same page so that we all know what we're talking about right now, as well as jumping into kind of the origins of the environmental and climate justice movement, because I think they're a little different than some people may understand them to be. And also go over some of like the founding principles, practices, and just ways that we orient to this work. And then we'll wrap things up by sharing different ways that folks can be getting more involved with it. So to get us started off, I'm going to jump in with a definition for you all of environmental justice. This comes from a project that we put together with a bunch of other groups called the People's Orientation to a Regenerative Economy. It was a few years ago, kind of our way of saying like, this is what our Green New Deal would look like. And so it has some really great definitions in it. And the way that we've come to define environmental justice is that it embraces the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations, including human health. And so, you know, it recognizes that due to racism, class discrimination, communities of color, low-income neighborhoods, indigenous nations, and, you know, other communities are most likely to be disproportionately harmed by toxic chemicals, exposed to pollutants and economic injustices and negative land uses, and that they're least likely to benefit from the efforts to improve the environment. And I will pass it over to you, Monica.
Yeah. So the origins of, you know, fights against environmental justice, climate justice have been a long and continued fight for Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities, and especially those of poor white rural communities. And one of those accounts had, you know, kind of being the 1968 Memphis sanitation worker strike. But one of the most pivotal kind of political events that began the environmental justice movement took place in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, through the Civil Disobedience Campaign. And that was to protest a landfill in the county for disposables of PCBs. And, you know, PCBs have been known to cause cancer and a number of serious kind of health effects, including, you know, immune system, reproductive system issues, and various nervous system issues. So this act of civil disobedience was really rooted in the lineage of the civil rights movement, and this is one of the first instances that we kind of see the merging of the civil rights movement and the environmental justice movement as, you know, kind of connection between climate and environmental justice movement that was, you know, at the time was primarily being led by upper white middle class, you know, people and formations. And so this led to, you know, in 1987, toxic waste and there was a toxic waste and race report that was released. And so this is the first kind of documentation of environmental racism. That then led to the 1991 People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit, where these 17 principles of the environmental justice movement were adopted. And then in 1996, where the Jimenez Principles for Democratic Organizing was put together. And so it's important to note that many groups, you know, kind of recognize these principles and even, you know, have them up on their websites, but don't actually practice these principles at its core. And so we, you know, need to commit to them and holding others accountable to them if we are truly fighting for climate and environmental justice. And then you can go to the next slide. I just want to give a kind of highlight of what I guess the emergence of the climate justice movement, and here are some highlights of events that took place that led to the formation of the climate justice movement. So you can kind of see here from about 2009 on to 2014, many things definitely happened in between this, but here are just some very notable accounts that really helped the movement come to fruition.
I'll jump in really quick, just to mention there's a really, I feel like it's a really important turning point within the broader climate and environmental movement, which was the People's Climate March of 2014. So it was already slated to be this really, really big event. And as soon as Climate Justice Alliance, the folks who founded the Alliance, a lot of other groups that we owe all of our origins to, Indigenous Environmental Network, Grassroots Global Justice, Right to the City Alliance, and other smaller, local groups, they all really, really pushed to make sure that it was our members and our grassroots folks that led this event. And if it wasn't for that fight, that frankly, it was a fight that happened at that time, you wouldn't have seen the sign front lines of crisis, forefront of change at the People's Climate March in 2014. And that was really like our members, the people who formed this alliance and really founded and created the climate justice movement, are the ones who demanded that it was Indigenous people, it was people of color, it was the frontline communities that really led this march, because as they said, right, like they're the first impacted, they're the worst impacted. So let's have them there first, right? And let's hear their voices first. And so there was this, for those who aren't as familiar, it was over 400,000 people at this march in New York City. And it was originally proposed by CJA members to coincide with the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples and the International Climate Summit. And it was co-organized by a lot of different frontline groups, UPROS, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, Ironbound Community Corporation, a handful of others, including the other alliances I mentioned before. And our community alone represented about 30,000 that showed up to that. And so it was just a really big turning point. And at that point, the term climate justice was starting to be used more often. And we're still running into it today where a lot of people don't fully understand what that term means. And so also, this comes from the People's Orientation to the Regenerative Economy. The definition that we like to use is that climate justice focuses on addressing systemic, sorry, I got lost here. Addressing the root causes of the climate crisis through an intersectional lens of racism, classism, economic injustice, and environmental harm. So it focuses on making systemic changes that are required to address the unequal burdens that our communities are facing and to realign our economy with our natural systems. And one way, so I work with donors, and one thing that I just like to say that I know can be a little jarring for folks, but when I'm trying to get the point across for people about climate justice and the difference is that climate justice doesn't mean woke environmentalism. So the histories are completely different, as you see here, right? Like we have this history that's rooted in, that goes back to the civil rights movement, which arguably goes back to, the abolitionist movement, which goes back to the fight against colonization on this continent. And the environmental movement has roots that go back to early 1900s conservation. And there are, critiques that could be shared about that. I'm not going to get into them here, but I think just to recognize, and like Monica said earlier, that you see the principles that were created by climate justice and environmental justice groups all over websites, all over the internet. And a lot of them are groups that don't have their roots in this type of work and in the history that is shared by these communities that make up Climate Justice Alliance, and not just CJA, but other alliances of climate justice and frontline impacted communities. And so I think that's just like a really important point to make. And I'm going to pass it back over to Monica to share about how we define frontline communities.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so what do we mean by frontline communities? Well, frontline communities are those that are impacted first and worst by climate change and its root causes, including white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonization, as Mark just mentioned. Sometimes environmental justice communities or frontline communities are called sacrifice zones. And the communities that are poor and working, working class, Black, brown, multiracial, white communities and indigenous peoples, these are the folks whose health, wealth, lives have been sacrificed to advance the profits of corporations that are controlled, that are like continuously polluting these communities. And so these specifically include communities that are impacted by pollution hotspots that are created by ports, transportation centers, fossil fuels, chemicals, manufacturing, mining, and industrial agricultural industries. And I'll pass it over to Mark to share a little bit about what we mean by systemic change.
Yeah, so for systemic change, for us, it's really about dismantling and transforming systems that perpetuate injustice, right? So it's not enough just to talk about carbon, right? We have to talk about why it is there, right? Why are we doing this to our planet? What are the systems that are leading to carbon being spewed into the atmosphere, and how do we change those systems? And really, just like what we're experiencing is it's the combination and the intersection of so many different things when you look at the issues related to what's causing the climate crisis, but also all kinds of other injustice in the world, right? The issues with migration, and issues related to war, and issues related to famine and poverty and houselessness and all those things. Like, it comes down to what we've mentioned, right? It's white supremacy, it's extractive capitalism, it's patriarchy. And so to say that we're going to solve the climate crisis just by stopping pollution, yeah, we might end up having, more time on this earth as a global society, but the majority of people are still going to be so oppressed by that global society that what's the point, right? And so what we're really saying here is we need to think deeper, and we need to think about what's causing these crises that are intersecting, and really a holistic approach, right? And if we're talking about sustainability, even, it's not sustainable to just think that we're going to solve these problems with tote bags and compostable straws, right? The more that we try to convince people that that's what's going to save the world, the more people are burning out. Like, we have to be honest about this, and we really have to be frank right now, because we have a decade left to get this done. And if we spend that decade focused on really minute, tiny, minuscule fixes compared to the actual scale of this problem, we're not going to solve this problem. And so I think it's just so important that we think about it from this really, really deep level, which is, it's hard, it's scary, it's anxiety provoking, just like the problem that we're facing. But to me, it's almost easier once you acknowledge the scale of the problem, because then then we've acknowledged it and we can actually address it, right? Instead of being stuck kind of spinning our wheels like we've been doing as a collective movement for half a century now. And so the nice thing is we haven't just named it, right? Like, people have actually turned this into models for change. So we have these different systemic change models that exist, that have been around for, some are fairly new, some have been around for quite a while. There are some that are pretty common here in the United States. And there's others that are very common internationally that just resonate differently with different cultures. And so just to really quickly mention, there's the just transition principles. That's another term that gets tossed around a lot, is just transition. But there's a whole framework and principles and practice that has been developed by CJA members along with a lot of other folks. And then there's also indigenous principles of just transition. There's concepts like buen vivir that are more international focused. And for now, we're just going to jump into this idea of just transition. And I'll pass it back to Monica.
Yeah. So this is definitely a speedy version, kind of overview of the just transition framework. There's so much information in this. There's a training that we do for our members, and this framework actually was put together by Movement Generation and other frontline leaders in at the time was called the Our Power Campaign, which later became the Climate Justice Alliance. Um, so this is like doing it no justice, just so you all know, because there was so much, thoughtfulness that was put into even putting this together as a framework. But the origins of the concept of the just transition goes back to the labor movement. Just transition strategies were first forged by labor unions um, and environmental justice groups that came together to really get rooted in, what it's going to take to phase out these harmful industries and create these sustainable local living economies. And so the just transition framework kind of provides a visual tool that outlines how we move from an extractive economy, which you see here on the left, and to moving toward local living regenerative economies, which you see on the right. And so when we talk about, just transition, we identify six primary sectoral shifts that need to happen to move us toward that local living regenerative economy. And these sectoral shifts include food sovereignty, energy democracy, safe and affordable housing, as well as transit equity and clean transit, zero waste, and our ecosystem, the restoration of our ecosystem as well. So just transition is typically moved through projects, policies, and campaigns to both fight the bad, but also build the new. And so these are some of the key sectoral shifts that we've identified in order to really make those regenerative economies and really move us toward that local living regenerative economy. And it looks differently in each place. Um, I want to share some other kind of powerful just transition work that's happening across our membership. You all heard from Lyndsay a little bit earlier, and we have so many people who are just moving amazing work and proving that these solutions actually do cool the planet and are in right relationship with the earth. And so I want to uplift, one of the frontline communities that's a member of CJA and are leading in energy democracy right now, from community owned rooftop solar and offshore wind in New York City, which is led by Uprose and New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, to reforming electric cooperatives in Appalachia, led by the Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, onto renewable energy policies in the Midwest that's been led by Village of Environmental, Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. But these are some communities that are doing some amazing work and moving us toward that just transition through the work in energy democracy. And here's some other examples around what that looks like when it comes to food sovereignty. So one of the members of the Climate Justice Alliance, are leading powerful food sovereignty initiatives. It's not just about, growing food or growing like culturally relevant foods. It is about doing that in a ways that respect the earth, that help to remediate the soil and utilize traditional growing methodologies. But it's also about, it definitely is also about being able to have access to feeding our communities food that we know will sustain them and nourish them. Um, Food sovereignty efforts within CJA, they do stretch from Puerto Rico to the Southwest, to the Midwest, to California, and the Pacific Northwest to indigenous territories. And some of these efforts and some of the photos that you see are led by Soil Generation, Black Dirt Farm Collective, Detroit Black Food Security Network, Organización Boricua, and Urban Tilth, and so many others are also leading in these various sectors as well on the ground. So just wanted to provide y'all with a couple of examples. And, here are also a few other just transition projects to just, show the kind of multitude of ways that can look from community to community. So Cooperation Richmond, which engages several CJA members in the Richmond, California area. Cooperation Richmond is a non-extractive finance model that supports the launch of worker-owned and community-owned cooperatives, and these with the goal of advancing the just transition. We have our members Earthbound building Earthbound that are building farm and forestry, which grew from Black Dirt Farm Collective, and it's also a Black worker owned, cooperative. It's a natural building cooperative that resides in the Mid Atlantic, and so they design and build ecological, um, and affordable and functional homes and farm infrastructure for rural landowners and farmers. We have the New Malo refillery. That's a zero waste project connected to the Micronesia Climate Change Alliance, where people can purchase household products by refilling their containers, thereby reducing the consumption of plastic. And this gives you a good idea of what, hopefully provides you with some idea of the range of projects, and the range of ways that, uh, transitions are happening in communities already in ways that are, again, respectful of the land, and in right relationship with each other as a people. And so you'll notice a couple of kind of common denominators across these projects is that they all involve these things: being in right relationship with each other, community control, and respecting the earth. Um, and so to close out, we'll go over a few ways that you all can get involved and support this type of work, and how to get connected. I'll pass it back over to Mark.
Thanks, Monica. And I added a slide that I didn't tell Monica about, but we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary. So I just wanted to shout that out and just pay some respect to everybody who laid the foundation for CJA to be what it is today. And as part of that celebration, we hosted a large convening earlier in September, and there was about 300 members came out. And you can see in that top left and the top right, we threw just a giant party at the same time, because we were like, look, like we're always just working for the community. And it's so like nobody ever celebrates the people working for the community, right? And so we did our best to honor that. But we also got a lot of work done and did a lot. So that was really exciting. But yeah, I'll just jump in really quick to share. When people are asking me like, how do I get more involved, or like, how do I do this work, right? Like, I think it's hard when you're defining something like climate or environmental justice as like a direct impacted frontline community, because if you're not a part of that community, it can feel kind of hard to like, how do I go do that thing, right? If I'm being defined out of that community a little bit. And believe me, like I feel it. I didn't grow up in a really, really like significantly impacted community, but it's a thing that you can still do, right? You can show up in the right way. And so I like to just share, like on our website there's a list of all of our members. It's broken down by region, and so you can see like whatever region you're in, you can look for frontline members there. And you can also look, we have the international section and national section, so you can see other alliances and other networks that we work with. That for me, that's just kind of like, if they're within that range, we've vetted them, right? And like we've worked with them and they are saying that they're adhering to those principles we've mentioned. We're all supporting each other. We're all doing this work for the same reasons. And so those are some really good places to look if you're trying to get more involved in this, like directly on the ground, working with these communities. And I just have a few pointers to share really quick. If you are thinking about getting more involved with an environmental or climate justice community. So the first one is just like, don't take up too much space. Like be ready to listen, observe, and really take the lead of that community. The second, remember that these communities just really come from generations of survival and resistance. And so they might need to move at the speed of trust, right? Like you might be there ready to offer, but these people have a lot of reasons not to trust people right away. So just be ready to enter a process of building trust with the community if you want to do this work. And then the final thing is really like get creative with what you have to offer, because there's so much support that these communities can use aside from financial help, right? There's like labor, like just actually helping at a community garden or painting or whatever. But there's also legal counsel, if you have any type of medical training, being a street medic for a direct action event can be really important. And there's all other kinds of reasons that people can get involved in, or ways that people can get involved. And I'll pass it to Monica really quick for one other thing that can be helpful.
Yeah. Well, just to reiterate, there are a lot of things that are being called solutions when it comes to climate change. I mean, Mark gave some really good examples and grounding about like what it's really gonna take. It's about reducing our plastic, but it's also about being in right relationship with each other and the earth. And so, if you're trying to figure out what to support, always remember, if a proposed approach does not address the root cause of the climate crisis or perpetuates harm to communities, if it continues to concentrate wealth and power, then it's not a solution. And so you may hear these things called false solutions, false promises, or even techno fixes. But what do you support as an individual and as organizations? Like, we developed this tool here that Mark is sharing in the chat, and so hopefully this is a simple tool that will help you all out. And it's called the People Solutions Lens. And so here are the primary questions, like 4 simple questions that you should ask yourself. Who makes the decision? Who benefits and how? What else will this impact? And how will this build or shift power? And these are, we would say our ways that we identify how are we really, if something is really rooted in if a project, or if a climate solution is really a solution, or if a transition is truly just. And I'll pass it over to Mark to share also just some other pathways to support.
Yeah, so this is just last thing. I think we went a little bit over time. Sorry, Rhonda. Sorry, Earth Gives folks. I know how it is. But this is another resource that we've been a part of creating along with a lot of other folks. If you all haven't picked it up yet, we work a lot with a lot of people all the time to do things. It's very seldom that it's like just CJA came up with something. But one of the like sections of work that we do, we call Move the Money. And we're kind of in a unique position because we've actually been mandated by our members. Our original four-year strategy, our members said that CJA must influence $40 million in new philanthropic dollars to move towards environmental and climate justice work. Which is why there's a lot of alignment between Rhonda and the work Rhonda's been doing with what we're trying to do, right? As like Rhonda's like, the number's too low, and our folks were like, that number's too low. And that was like one of the things they asked us to really do. And so my team, the resource mobilization team, we're thinking not just how do we engage with a funder or a donor to get their money, we're thinking how do we influence this individual or this institution to give money in a completely different way, in a way that considers the actual impacts, and not just how do they give money, but how do they invest their money, right? We have philanthropy is only required to give away 5% of their assets every year. So what's happening with that other 95%? A lot of it's sitting in the stock market, going into these companies that our communities are fighting every day. And so if a foundation is trying to say that they are aligned with the climate justice movement and they're giving money to the movement, but their investments are all in NASDAQ and whatever other just, hedge funds, their money's way more of their money is fighting us than it is helping us. And so this is one of the tools we've developed that we call the 4 pathways to move money to the grassroots. And so the most obvious one is give money directly to them. That's obvious, most simple, just do that. And give it away unrestricted and multiple years, just do that. Another way, kind of like Lyndsay was mentioning, kind of the getting money to a broader segment of the movement, is to give to grassroots-led alliances and networks. CJA being one, Alliance for Appalachia. There's a lot of other ones out there. And then this third one's a really amazing and really cool piece that I love, is to give money to community-controlled capital infrastructure. And the really short way that I like to think of this is basically creating a feedback loop within the community. So when you give money to a project in that community, it stays there. So these are things like community land trusts, worker-owned cooperatives, non-extractive finance mechanisms, and other things like that, which I can speak to more if people are interested during the Q&A. And then there's also grassroots-centric funder intermediaries. So, private or public charitable foundations that have been established for the purpose of moving money to these grassroots groups and are being led and accountable by them. And so those are that's kind of our last little bit of how to get involved. I can pass it back to Monica if you have anything last to say to wrap up. Otherwise, thank you all so much for having us here.
You said it. Thank you all so much for the time and just having an opportunity to share.
Thank you. What an incredible presentation. I've learned so much. So I want to open it up for questions for everyone before we go into the breakouts. But maybe I'll kick off a question. And I left this out, my apologies. Only 0.5% of philanthropy goes to climate justice work. And I think if you even drill that down further, you're going to see how small of a financial nut that is. And I've always understood that until you lift up those, wherever they can be, then everyone is more successful. So for the question, I wonder what you've seen as a successful solution that you would suggest we could replicate. So whether we get involved in one of the organizations or we take it on ourselves to do this work. I mean, I've got all kinds of ideas going on a project I'm working on relating to composting and methane. But what thoughts might you have around that?
Can I clarify? Are you thinking like what we would consider like a climate justice project, or are you thinking about ways of moving the money?
Well, moving the money would be great. And in fact, Bill McKibben talked a lot about that at the last Power Hour. And there were many, many people very interested. And I think we have an opportunity, certainly for even nonprofits, to understand that more deeply and what they can do. But I was thinking something more project-wise. Would you replicate more marches because you've seen great impact there and ripple effects that come out of that? Would you replicate more things that are very hands-on? I mean, you talk about the local impact. So does something come to mind that you think about that, if we knew about this thing that really accomplished a lot that we could be supportive of?
I'm interested to hear your idea, Monica, if you have any.
I mean, all of those things are important. When we talk about like building power and our membership is primarily made up of base building members. And so the strategies range from, running campaigns at the municipal level to marches to hands-on projects. I think what Mark mentioned about the approach and building that authentic like relationship so that community is also like trusting of the relationship that's being started. I think all of those strategies are important in resourcing. I like it, because of a just transition and what we have found with working with our base building members. You heard me mention about the Our Power campaign is how we got a chance to look at specifically 7 communities and really learn about what a just transition was and what it was not. And so it's really not a like cookie cutter approach when it comes to, how to make that real on the ground. So building those deep relationships with those communities to really understand like their work and their strategy to really show that investment. So I don't have like a one thing is better than the other because that is when we talk about respect and place-based organizing, the strategies from community to community look completely different. And so really finding out how invested, like those 4 questions that we brought up in the people solutions lens, those are the questions that one should ask themselves in how to kind of build those type of relationships. Yeah, did you have any things you want to share too, Mark?
Yeah, so I think so one point that I heard early on getting involved with Climate Justice Alliance that really has stuck with me is that we are never going to be able to build any solution to scale to solve the climate crisis. What we have to do is aggregate solutions to scale, right? And which means, kind of to elaborate on what Monica was saying, is it is so profoundly different the way that Bozeman, Montana is going to usher in a just transition, right? Because ours is, I don't know if there's a single smokestack in the valley that I live in, right? And like there might be one at the college. I think they might have one that I've seen before, but other than that, like we don't have any smokestacks. So like what I'm dealing with here is thinking about, transportation emissions that come from the absurd amount of tourism of people who go to Yellowstone National Park every year from all around the world. I'm thinking about just the transportation along the I-90 corridor that's affecting people. And that is so different than what life looks like in Appalachia, or, like our members that live in communities that are just on all 4 sides. They have refineries and smokestacks and things like that. So that's like, it's a hard question to answer, but I think one thing that CJA has really dug into is just this idea, and kind of what I was getting at a little bit is this idea of like, what does the regenerative economy look like? Like, what is an alternative to capitalism look like at the local scale, at the state, regional, national scale? Because I think that really is the way that if I can sit here in Bozeman, Montana, and do everything in my power to make sure that Bozeman, Montana is building a regenerative economy that is not harming the environment and is no longer harming people, and everybody else in their own communities is doing every single thing they can to do that in their own community, that's what we mean by aggregate to scale, right? And I think like recently, like I have 2 young children, and recently I've just been getting really real about this, right? Is like CJ is out here and we're just like, just transition, right? Like that is what we need. We need to see a new regenerative economy in every single community. And I think like it gets real and scary, right? Is like in 50 years and 75 years, thinking about my children who are going to be aging, at that point, they're going to be figuring out how to just stay comfortable when they're really old, right? Like at that point in their lives, I need to do everything that I can to make sure that where I live is insulated from the complete decline of globalized infrastructure, right? Because that's a possibility with climate change and what we're looking at in the next 75 to 100 years, that is a possibility, and that could be happening. And so I think for me, there's this part about like, how do we do it at a global scale? But my other question is just like, how do I make this place okay for my kids and for their kids, so that in the future they can be living their best life still, and they're going to be insulated from all of the chaos and turmoil that may potentially come from that collapse. While at the same time, if I'm doing all that work right now and we're all doing that work, we could actually mitigate that collapse, right? And we could avoid it at the same time, which would be awesome. And then things are just better all around, and we're dealing with a lot less of the just really horrifying, more apocalyptic potential future out there. But
that would be nice. I mean,
yeah.
Considering my son was
forever,
stuck in his apartment, considering my son was stuck in his apartment in Brooklyn when the flood hit. So that got really real,
Yes.
and I'm so glad I told him to not get a basement apartment. I want to open it up to other questions. People, folks, Catherine, Jordan, anybody else who wants to ask a question, feel free to come off mic and ask Mark and Monica what you're curious about.
Hi, my name is Lauren Click. I'm the founder of Let's Go Compost. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, also a part of Earth Gives, and we're on a mission to make composting free and accessible because we found it's one of the most equitable ways people can reduce their carbon and methane outputs after buying an electric vehicle, which is obviously not in most people's budget right now. My question goes back to your community garden input. So we work with a lot of community gardens to enact free composting programs and volunteer programs so they can get access to fresh, healthy local food. But a really big issue that we're running into is that a lot of the communities where these community gardens serve, they're working 12 hours a day, often do not have a college education. So they're working 2 or 3 jobs on top of that. And so it's really hard for them to get out to volunteer at a community garden, even if they do find climate change to be a really pressing issue for themselves or their children. So I was wondering if you had any suggestions on how we can encourage more people to come out and volunteer with us in the community gardens and get more involved.
I think one thing that just comes to mind is, so you used the term the community served. And to me, I think there's a question about how do we get the community to lead, right? And I think if you look at the research, the studies, the surveys, people of color, brown people, poor people do see climate change as a bigger threat than privileged white people, right? That's just kind of a fact at this point. And so it's generally, like you're saying, it's not that the community isn't concerned, but a lot of the groups that we work with, it's the community that has created it. And so I think finding a way to me, it goes to like, who are the elders in that community that y'all can be engaging with and figuring out how to like I was saying, like moving at the speed of trust, like working with these people to build that trust with the trusted people in the community so that they can they can get a sense of what y'all are doing and be like, oh yeah, like they're cool. They're with us. But like just working from that angle, like I think when we're doing movement building and organizing, it's really about like just deep relationship building. Like there's events that I go to, there are trainings and workshops where all you do for a few days is literally you just are there building relationships with each other. There's not even the suggestion of a future transaction that could happen, right? It's just about building that relationship. So that's my first thing that I would go to, is just trying to figure out how to get connected. And there's a lot of groups that are probably involved in these places, right? Like doing a lot of work, like churches. There's probably nonprofits already in those communities. So just working to figure out who's already doing the work, and then just really building with them. But I'll pass it to you, Monica.
No, yeah, that was exactly what I was gonna say. I come from, prior to my time being at CJA, one of the members of the CJA membership. And one of the ways that that was done was through surveying the community, building those relationships, not just surveying them. Like first off, is like definitely what Mark said, building those relationships and being able to build assessments from that built trust that's established. Some other ways that we have seen the ways that folks have brought community into and made sure that they were also able to directly benefit is things like time banking or just kind of being creative about, this concept of time and also, yeah, like what Mark said about not being transactional about it. But those are just some of the ways. But I definitely want to like echo what Mark said about the relationships and being very intentional about that, because there's where the wisdom is, and how to work the land. Also, the connections that's needed. So elders, but also working with youth, and really building something that's intergenerational, so that is like building beyond, the garden. It's like building movement right there in that community as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think a large issue that they're having is that a lot of people before COVID would volunteer at the garden. They had insanely high volunteer rates, and then after COVID, many of those people had moved away. So now it's about engaging, the new neighbors who might not know they have this incredible resource right on the other side of their back door. But they do have a senior center right there. So maybe I should go reach out to them and find some ways that they can lead.
And one
Thank
thing,
you.
well, just really quick, one thing.
Yeah.
I just looked up Let's Go Compost, and it's about making composting free and accessible. But if you got community gardens and you can go give people some free food, they're gonna start listening really quick. Like, I think if you're talking about people who are working 12 hours a day, they're probably a little less worried about like where their food waste is going than they're worried about like feeding and
Yeah,
supplementing kids,
100%.
right?
Yeah,
And so
that's why.
if you can find ways to like think about like what is it that they actually want, right? Like they want this, they want to do something good, but they're also just like, I'm grinding right now and shit's rough. Sorry. And and so finding a way to like give an offering at the same time as making an ask, I think can also be really, really beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's a great call. Awesome. Thank you so much.
You made me think of the idea of people gardening, nurturing the garden of people and connection. Alexandra, you look like you've got something to say, so I want to invite you.
I don't know. Yeah, lots and lots of ideas. I guess the thing that's been mulling around my head is sort of the importance of kind of action and on the ground versus the importance of sort of communication and education, and how like which is more important. I mean, that's not really a fair question, but I don't know if you want to sort of comment on kind of we sort of need both things, I think, or or do you think one is more powerful than the other?
You go first, Monica.
Like all are needed. The comms is a part of, the base building strategy. Like all of the pieces are needed. When we talk about the Our Power communities, which is our like base building membership, they come up with this very detailed plan after we created that framework, and looked at those hot spots that I mentioned of looking at 7 communities where just transition was happening, where it wasn't happening, what it was and what it was not. Um, and the things that the strategies that folks listed out as far as like what our vision, our plan, goals and objectives were, all of those things were listed as a part of, essential to really building out a base. So, and most of these communities are, have lesser staff and are doing multiple, multiple of the things when it comes to like holding the base building, but holding comms at the same time, just about getting it out and getting the word out as well. So I don't have a one that's like, oh, that's over the other, because all of the strategies, all the tools are needed to fulfill the strategy. And our members that don't even have so many, so many staff are like doing these things and holding multiple roles within their community. And it's really about like just holding, like filling the need that's there. So yeah, all of this, I know that's like really, but all of the things are needed. All of the tools are needed to fulfill the strategy.
The power of the word "and."
Yeah, both and, right? It's definitely a both and kind of situation.
So we actually we're we're 3 years into a project called Communicating Our Power. That started, and really the genesis of it was continually hearing from our members, we really think communications is important, and we can barely even pay our organizing staff, right? Like they can even barely pay an ED, right? They can barely pay anybody to do anything. And so they're like, how am I going to get to doing like paying for comms, right? And so we actually piloted a project with the Solutions Project, and I think there may be some other people involved, probably because, like I said, we work with everybody all the time. And we actually developed a curriculum and I think it was close to a $10 million budget over 3 years to get 20 of our grassroots base building organizations to staff a full-time communications fellow at their organization. And they were all part of a cohort where they were doing some like collective learning together, building their skills, building their chops, but then they also had access to, you know, CJA and kind of a more national comms perspective, and able to get some really cool Center for Story-Based Strategy. That was the other group. So it was us three groups that really made this happen. And I think one thing that I just want to elaborate on too is, in organizing, one of the first things that I ever learned about was this idea called the spectrum of allies. I don't know if people here are familiar with that one. I'll share it in the chat, but basically it's like looking at, you kind of got this semicircle, and all the way on one side is your active allies, all the way on the other side is your active opponents, and then you got the passive people in the middle. And I think the thing is that whenever we're thinking about taking an action, and an action can be a protest in the streets, it can be calling a senator, it can be, you know, locking down to a piece of heavy equipment, it can be whatever, it could be buying a tote bag. Any time we're engaging in an action, I think it's important to think about who we're trying to affect via that action. And if we're trying to affect our active opponents with a march, we're going to piss them off, but we're not going to change their mind, right? But we are going to really like empower our active allies, and we might even get some of our passive allies on board. And so I think it's really about like thinking strategically, what is it that we're trying to accomplish with any given action and any time we're trying to do something. And I actually think, to your point, or just to this point, Alexandra, is that communications is one of those places where we actually have a lot more ability to influence our passive and active opponents than we think, right? If you think about, like, what if we could be producing, you know, Hollywood level content that is really kind of slow drip infusing these ideas and getting them into the minds of people so that it just slowly nudges them. And because the other thing with that spectrum is you're never going to get an active person to jump to being an active ally, right? Like if they're actively against you, you just want to get them passive against you, right? You want them to shift them from being in the street showing up with the other neo-Nazis to being, you know, just someone annoying on Facebook and Twitter, right? Like that's what you're trying to make happen with those really extreme part on the opposite
That's
side.
a low bar, but okay.
Right. But so with that, I think communications really gives us that opportunity to be thinking about how can we influence people, like how can we change hearts and minds. And that's where like cultural organizing and cultural power is, like when we can get somebody that everybody loves to watch on screen or to listen to their music to say that they're down with this work, but in the right way. You know, that's the thing, is like not just for them to retweet us or not just for them to come out on stage and say the thing, but to have them think like, how do I influence the community that follows me who's obviously very not aligned with me? Like having those types of conversations, I think could be so powerful, especially at a time like right now.
So we could go on forever, but I want to leave at least 10 minutes for us all to have a chat in the breakout. So I want to thank Monica and Mark. I could have this conversation forever because both comms and strategy and literally systems changing around philanthropy is a dream. To create action and to build community and to affect change. And so I could go on, and we'd love to have you back, even just communicating back to all the nonprofits that are part of the Earth Gives community, whether they're participating in the Giving Day or not. So first of all, a huge thank you to Lyndsay and Mark and Monica. Stay tuned. We're going to break out in just a second. I just want to invite you for the one last time to invest in their work through earthgives.org, while we are hoping to really build beyond transaction and move towards transformation. We're a scrappy 501c3 startup inviting all kinds of folks to participate and realize that this ecosystem that is the environmental and climate justice nonprofit ecosystem deserves attention, just like climate technology or policy, that these folks are truly on, like Mark and Monica said, the front lines to the action and where it needs to happen. So I'm going to invite you all to make sure you head there before Thursday or several times through Thursday. We've got matching dollars and prize fund dollars and all kinds of other things to hand out to nonprofits that bring in the most donors and the most dollars, but even from your heart to invest in their work. That would be great.